Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I am genuinely so glad you've decided to join me today. I want to welcome you warmly because today we are stepping into some difficult, battle-scarred, but deeply sacred territory together. As we look at how to navigate the troubling parts of Scripture, I want to be your guide. If you have ever felt your heart drop or your anxiety spike while reading certain biblical passages, please know you are absolutely not alone. There is so much grace for this journey, and today we're going to find a pathway toward true peace and understanding.
Okay, let's dive into this. Countless believers wrestle with a really heavy question in the quiet of their own hearts. What do we do when the Bible, a text that is supposed to bring us divine love and comfort, instead brings us fear, confusion, or even disgust? If you've ever felt triggered or repelled by violent scriptures, I want to validate that pain for you right now. Feeling troubled by violence, oppression, or cruelty in the text doesn't mean your faith is broken. Actually, it means your God-given sense of justice and compassion is working exactly as it should.
There's this quote by writer Janie Hogan that I think just hits the nail on the head. It perfectly captures that deep internal conflict so many of us experience. She writes, "I'd pick up my Bible and scroll through, and the heartache and hurt I was feeling got worse. Just imagine seeking a word of comfort only to encounter a portrayal of God or humanity that feels rough, hateful, or terrifying. It creates an agonizing cognitive dissonance. When the very source we turn to for peace triggers our trauma, we have to find a new way to engage with it."
Section 1. Facing Texts of Terror.
To find a new way forward, we have to honestly name the elephant in the room. The scholar Phyllis Tribble famously categorized several Old Testament narratives as texts of terror. And honestly, that's exactly what they are. Hagar, used as a slave and just thrown away. Tamar, violated and discredited by her own family. An unnamed concubine whose fate in the book of Judges is literally almost too horrific to speak aloud. Jephthah's daughter, sacrificed all because of a completely faithless vow. Let's just let the heavy, dark weight of these stories sit with us for a second. These are real stories of abuse, silence, and profound human cruelty, recorded right in the middle of our sacred text.
So the crucial point is this: how do we respond? Our natural instinct is to sanitize or ignore these verses, right? Preachers skip them, we gloss over them in Sunday school. But avoiding them leaves us completely isolated and vulnerable to a faith-shattering shock when we inevitably stumble upon them later. The alternative is engaging responsibly. We bravely wrestle with the text honestly. We don't try to justify the violence, no way, but we bring it into the light so it cannot silently destroy our faith.
Section 2. Scripture as Trauma Literature.
To engage responsibly, it helps to radically shift our perspective on what kind of book the Bible actually is. A lot of it is trauma literature. The scriptures don't just contain a neat, tidy list of moral rules, they embody the chaotic, bloody, and overwhelming experience of human trauma. Think of biblical lament poetry. These poems give a raw, unfiltered voice to the internal overwhelm and the fragmenting of the human soul in a violent world, and often they do it without providing tidy resolutions. The Bible holds space for our deepest pains.
Section 3. God's Progressive Revelation. Let's move to and see how this builds over time. Pope Benedict outlines this really helpful concept called progressive revelation, showing how God educated humanity slowly. In the ancient era, God met deeply flawed, violent people right where they were. The law of Moses was given to mitigate the worst ancient damage, limiting retaliation, not endorsing it as the ideal. Then, in the prophetic era, God sent prophets to vigorously challenge collective injustice. Finally, we reach the first century, the Gospel. Jesus arrives as the definitive, ultimate revelation of God's will, stepping in to break the cycle of violence entirely.
Section 4. The Lens of Jesus. And this brings us to the ultimate solution. In her profound analysis, Phyllis Tribble connects the agonizing stories of Old Testament women directly to the suffering of Jesus. She writes, "She was wounded for our transgressions. My God, why have you forsaken her?" By applying the language of Christ's passion to these abused women, we see something incredibly moving. God is absolutely not on the side of the abusers. God is uniquely identified with the victims, suffering right alongside them in their darkest moments.
If there is one single thing you take away from this explainer, please let it be this: God's character is always loving. If an ancient passage seems to portray God as a monster, we're not understanding it in its ultimate context. We have to view every dark verse through the lens of Jesus Christ. The cross shows us that, truly, God has no enemies to destroy. He only has a broken humanity to heal. His justice is never about violent retribution. It is always a peacemaking, restorative justice.
Section 5. Restorative circles for healing.
Once we find that theological clarity, we have to process these truths together as a community. This introduces restorative justice into our faith spaces. Retributive justice just asks what rule was broken and how do we punish the offender. But restorative justice asks who was harmed and how do we make things right. It is completely focused on shalom, a true land of peace and wholeness, rebuilding relationships rather than just dealing out punishment. This is the very biblical heartbeat of how God actually relates to a broken world.
The early church leaned heavily into this attitude of compassion. And we need that today, because when we gather to discuss difficult scriptures, we bring our own trauma with us. Human psychological multiplicity means that a verse that brings deep comfort to one person might trigger a panic attack in another, based on what they've lived through. To heal, our congregations must intentionally build spaces of profound safety, where the shattered parts of our stories can be gently brought into the light without any fear of judgment.
And this brilliantly illustrates how we can actually do this in practice. We can set up a restorative circle, which is a trauma-informed practice for processing heavy truths. First, you define the topic and intention, like, we are here to discuss this triggering passage. Second, invitation is entirely voluntary. No one is forced to be there. And third, you use a physical talking piece. When you hold the piece, you speak. When you don't, your only job is to listen. This physically removes all hierarchy and ensures every single voice is valued equally.
To make this space truly sacred, you follow some really specific guidelines. We basically replace our fast-paced, debate-centered, I need to prove you wrong communication with deep, sacred listening. You respect the talking piece, which means absolutely no interrupting. You speak and listen from the heart. You only speak from your own experience. And crucially, you completely refrain from attempting to persuade anyone else. When someone shares their pain, you don't correct their theology, you lay down your weapons, listen, and honor their humanity. Oh, and strict confidentiality is a must.
When Jesus was asked how often we should forgive and restore one another, he answered 70 times 7. Now, this isn't just a math equation, it's a profound theological statement. It proves that restoring love, breaking the endless cycle of violent retribution, is the very fabric of the universe. It is the defining characteristic of the God we serve, and it absolutely must be the defining characteristic of our communities.
Look, if you are in a season of doubting right now, or if you feel triggered by the Bible, just take a deep breath. It is perfectly okay to be in a messy process of learning. We don't have to understand every single ancient mystery or figure out exactly why a certain dark passage is in there. What we can do is rest confidently in the truth of God's perfect, loving character, and we can commit to walking through our doubts alongside a community that loves us.
We've covered a lot of really profound ground today, moving from the dark reality of traumatic texts to the beautiful, restorative light of Christ. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought. Will we continue to leave the difficult, scary texts hidden in the dark, letting them quietly erode our faith? Or will we bravely bring them into the restorative light of community, allowing God's perfect love to cast out our fear? The choice is ours. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today.